The title for the week-long symposium is Censorship in America. Is the First Amendment Dead? Programs, including times and speakers for the entire week, are available in the lobby, I believe, or at one of these tables in here. If you haven't picked up a program, please do so. Each day this week, there will be a presentation in the auditorium here, and that presentation will be followed by a panel discussion and audience response in the Bonner Room in the Student Union. The times are a little bit different each day for the presentations here in the auditorium, so be sure that you pick up the program. Also, available at the back table here are some T-shirts that are available for $8, and they will commemorate this week. So be sure, if you're interested, see the people at the back table for a T-shirt. This week's symposium is dedicated to the memory of a special person, a woman who throughout her life was committed to freedom, justice, and peace. A woman who attended every session of these symposiums for 10 straight years. This week is dedicated to Mary Schlosser because of her love for the First Amendment. In her honor, I'd like to recognize her daughter, Skip Cook, and family. Skip, will you stand, please? I'd also like to recognize the North Idaho College Board of Trustees. Those members who are here, are you here? Will you stand? We want to thank them particularly for their ongoing support for programs such as this. A few other introductions before we begin. Some others who share in the responsibility for this wonderful symposium. First, Dr. Robert C. Bennett, President of North Idaho College.
Good morning. This program, this series, to me is probably the most exciting series that I have witnessed since I've been on the campus. I'm very excited about it, and I'm glad to see so many people here. I would like to see this room completely filled. I would really like to offer a challenge to the students that are here, because it's for you primarily that this series exists. I would like for you to talk to your fellow students, share with them the program, and encourage them to come. The reason I say that is because I feel that NIC is doing something that is better than almost any other community college in the country with respect to convocations and popcorn forum. I don't know of another community college that gives this kind of effort to bringing to students the extra special that goes beyond the classroom. And from my experience, having been a college student, there's more to going to college than just going to class. And when we have these kind of experiences, they should be attended by all of our students, because they are the ones that are enriched. I am convinced that college should primarily give you new focus to your life and your perspective about what exists in your world. I think the speaker today is certainly going to give you a new perspective about interpreting history, and I'm very excited about hearing it. However, before I say any more about that, I'd like to make a comment about an individual that is on our staff, and in December was asked to leave to go to the Middle East. Last week he was welcomed back, and Jim Straub, I see you sitting in the audience. Would you take just a minute and stand, please? And I think we all would like to give you a round. Thank you very much. As I said, I'm very excited about this program. I hope you will enjoy it as much as I think you will, and you will be stimulated as much as I think you will. I want to thank Tony Stewart, Len Matty, and the Convocations Committee for putting forth all of the work that was necessary to bring this outstanding program to you. Thank you very much.
This popcorn series symposium is a collaborative effort in the true spirit of partnership. The symposium is co-sponsored not only by our own Convocations Committee, along with the popcorn series, but by the Idaho Centennial Commission. And we express our deep appreciation to the Centennial Commission for their support. Our thanks specifically to Harry Magnuson, who's chairman of the Idaho State Centennial Commission.
Chairman Matty, Dr. Bennett, Dr. Eisler, Tony Stewart, good friend Sue. It is a wonderful morning. It's great to be at this beautiful campus, beautiful Idaho, and to have an opportunity to share in the discussions that you're going to share in today and throughout this week. As many of you know, the Centennial Year has been a real good one for Idaho. It gave us an opportunity to reflect on our rich heritage. It gave us an opportunity to enjoy our wonderful beauty, not only of the geography, but of the people of Idaho. And it also gave us an opportunity to plan for the future. We had, as a very important major last event of our centennial year, a second century symposium. We had 700 people present, and we discussed and defined and deliberated on some of the major issues that are confronting our people in our state in the second century. We are hopeful that much good has come and will come out of that symposium, and I feel that we have started some thought processes. The Centennial provided an opportunity to work together and to bring the citizens of this state closer together. It provided an opportunity to renew our spirit and rekindle our pride in this great state. The Centennial Commission is highly pleased that North Idaho College has moved forward with the program to discuss the major issues and to plan for our second century. This symposium covers a very important area. While Idaho is a wonderful state, we do have conflicts, and we do have some very serious problems. Your deliberations and discussions will lead us to new understandings and hopefully better ways to communicate and to deal with conflicts and to plan for the future. I'm extremely pleased that your college has seen fit to plan this very, very major event. It's very significant for North Idaho, and it carries forward the spirit of our centennial, and I'm just delighted to be here. I commend the committee and Dr. Bennett, and I just appreciate the opportunity to spend a minute or two with you. Thank you.
Some final thank yous before we begin. Final thank yous to Sue Flamia, who is a member of the Centennial Commission and also a member of the Symposium Committee. Others on the Symposium Committee are Don Atha, Lorene Belmont, Angie Medell, Robert Singletary, and Duke Snyder. And I want to take an opportunity to give a special acknowledgement to Tony Stewart, who chairs this Symposium Committee, whose vision and dedication to the right and to the just make these symposiums possible. It's his determination that brings important issues and important speakers, not only before our NIC community, but before the larger community as well. We owe him a special thanks. Ago, as some of you know, Judy Silty stood in this very same spot to introduce our convocation speaker, Dr. Parker Palmer. Judy invited us at that time to participate in a conversation, which Dr. Palmer would begin. The topic for that conversation was how we come to understand truth in our lives. In other words, how we come to know determines how we live. Today and the rest of this week, we have an opportunity to continue that conversation. And I invite you to attend, to listen, to participate in that conversation. More importantly, I ask you to reflect on how the larger story, as Parker Palmer would put it, I ask you to reflect on how the larger story of each day's agenda intersects with your own personal story. How will what you come to know during this week influence how you live your life? How will what you learn or unlearn or relearn affect your life and the lives of the person sitting next to you, the person in front of you? Let us continue this conversation of learning and living. And I can think of no better person to begin our conversation this week than today's speaker. Dr. Eisler has a dramatic and highly unusual personal background. Born in Vienna, Austria, she found herself at the age of 6 a refugee from the Nazis. Escaping to Havana, Cuba, she grew up in the Havana tenements and at the age of 14 emigrated to the United States, where she studied sociology and anthropology at the University of California at Los Angeles. She earned a Phi Beta Kappa and later obtained a Juris Doctor from the UCLA School of Law. She has taught at the University of California and Immaculate Heart College at Los Angeles. She is an internationally known peace researcher and educator whose work is included in the first World Encyclopedia of Peace. She's a member of the General Evolution Research Group. She was the founder of the Los Angeles Women's Center Legal Program, the first of its kind in the United States. She has pioneered important legislation to help women and children. The Chalice and the Blade, her most recent work, has been hailed as the most important book since Darwin's Origin of the Species. It's a book that's spellbinding, a book that marks a profound shift in how we view our past, and I hope in how we live our future. Dr. Eisler's research is perhaps the first truly holistic study of our past, present, and future. And because of her many creative contributions to social science and society, Riane Eisler has often been called a modern Renaissance woman. It's truly an honor for me to introduce to you Dr. Riane Eisler, whose topic today is Building Foundations for Freedom of Speech, from Domination to Partnership. Dr. Eisler?
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Oh, she's gone already, and I'm all by myself here, suddenly. First of all, a very practical question. Can you hear me? Good. Well, that's a good start. I am really delighted to be here with you today. And I want to express my appreciation, well, to the college, particularly to Tony Stewart for his persistence, because he's been inviting me to come here for 3 years. And I've always said, well, you know, I'm trying to do this and I'm trying to do that, and I can't. But boy, am I glad I came, not only because, of course, this is an absolutely gorgeous place, but because this is such an important series of conferences, and particularly because the subject that we're dealing with this week is so fundamental. This question of our First Amendment, which is today under such massive attack. And what we're going to be doing, well, we're going to be doing a lot of things, but what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking both at the protections of the First Amendment, our freedom of speech, of assembly, the separation of church and state, of religion, that whole bundle, because they do go together, of course. But we're also going to be looking at the chronic attempts, really, to deny those protections to us. This is not the first time. I mean, just even in recent time, if you look at the turn of the century, when the American labor movement was beginning to organize against what was, well, not so euphemistically called the robber barons of that time, there were tremendous and violent attempts to deny freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. We've had the McCarthy years, haven't we? There are some of us here old enough to have remembered those. And now we've got another onslaught. And what we're going to be looking at, we're going to be looking at both the protections and at these chronic attempts to take them away, to infringe them, to limit them in a much larger context. We're going to be looking at them in the context of two alternatives for social and ideological organization, which those of you who are familiar with my work know I have called the dominator and the partnership models of society. And even beyond that, although that we're going to have to do rather sketchily or we'll be here for a week or so, we're going to be looking at them in the even larger context of our cultural evolution. And this, I hope, will make it possible for us to understand better why this chronic undermining attack on these protections keeps happening, and even more important, what it is that we need to do to lay the solid foundations, upon which these human rights protections, as well as other human right protections, including a human right that I am beginning to talk about a great deal, the human right to freedom from fear of violence. Interesting that we haven't been talking about that right, but I'll get to that, because there's a reason, and it's connected with what I call the dominator model of society, okay? How can we lay the foundations, so that these will become solid protections, so that we don't waste all of our creative and wonderful energy constantly fighting defensive battles, which really impedes our human thrust, our human development. So I'm going to be talking to you about connections. I mean, this is really what my work is very much about. About, for example, and this is something that I'll come back to time and time again, about the connection between what happens in the so-called public, political, economic sphere, and what happens in the so-called private or personal sphere. Freedom of speech in the family, and freedom of speech, of course, in the state. It's like the hip bone is connected to the knee bone, is connected to the ankle bone. These are related, even though we have become so accustomed to simply not think in terms of those connections. And as I said, I want to really start with an evolutionary perspective. And of course, if we look at freedom of expression from an evolutionary perspective, something very, very interesting and actually quite obvious immediately jumps up at us. And it is that this issue of freedom of speech is a very, very basic thing for us as a species, because we uniquely have language. We uniquely have that capacity, don't we, to use language, to communicate what we want, what we feel, what we think is just, what we think is unjust. So I would like to suggest to you that this is an evolutionarily grounded right for our species. And yet, if we really look at most of recorded history, this is hardly a right that has been protected. In fact, even in our nation, in the United States, which justly prides itself and should pride itself on this really watershed contribution, the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment. Even here, let me just give you one example. Almost 100 years after that amendment was ratified. By the way, we're now celebrating, of course, the 200th anniversary, aren't we? So this is very appropriate that we be talking about this and finally, lay some foundations for it to sort of root, Even 100 years, actually the majority, because women are the majority, were denied freedom of speech. Not only in the public sphere, because of course you know that women were not supposed to talk in public, that the women who did that were looked at, as sort of a cross between, a terrible sinner and a dancing bear. An oddity, right? And some horrible person who was violating some fundamental command. Well, of course the command was very simple, wasn't it? A very interesting dominator command, let women be silent. And that command not only manifested itself in the public sphere, but in the private sphere. In a private sphere where in the 19th century, those of you who are acquainted with a history that we are not taught, which we must start being taught. Because that's another aspect of freedom of speech, isn't it? What are we taught as history? I'm going to digress for a second because I used to hate history. I didn't want to memorize when who killed who. I really didn't want to memorize all those dates of who killed who. But there is much more to history, isn't it? And one of the things about history was the struggle of women for laws that would, for example, repeal the common law situation where a man could legally beat his wife. Then there was a legal reform. The famous rule of thumb? As long as it was, that was a reform, hey. See, this was now the good news. He can only beat her with a stick no thicker than his thumb. And of course, talk about freedom of speech. If we're talking about police and government repression of freedom of speech, here you had it right there, in the home. And of course it was those very same laws that were then applied to black slaves, both women and men. It was the common law affecting women. So what I'm really trying to sort of present to you is a holistic view. I'm trying to suggest to you that if we look at human rights from this larger perspective, we begin to see that actually that First Amendment had to buck an awful lot of what I call dominator traditions. Traditions, for example, that children should be seen, not heard. Interesting issue about freedom of speech, isn't it? Right? Where do we start here? In really getting people to respect freedom of speech if we're constantly trying to break out of that. So what I am suggesting to you here is that we need to expand, first of all, our view of the First Amendment, particularly of freedom of speech. That we need to stop making that arbitrary distinction between the so-called public and the so-called private sphere. That we need to start looking at it in a larger context. For the simple reason that if we are to have protection of that basic, evolutionarily rooted human right as well as of all of our human rights, we have to build the foundations in the place where we learn our fundamental habits of thinking and of feeling and of behavior, which is, of course, in our intimate relations. particularly in our formative years. But at the same time, I'm going to suggest to you that we also need to re-examine what we really mean by protected speech. And specifically, about speech that incites to violence and hate against traditionally powerless groups in a society. Of course, in our society, these traditionally powerless groups have been women, they have been blacks, they have been Jews, and I'm suggesting to you that in some ways, that kind of incitement to violence and incitement to hate speech without accountability, not talking censorship, but I am talking accountability, actually serves to undermine all of our other human rights because it maintains a dominator model of social organization. For example, one of the characteristics of a dominator model is what we call scapegoating, where people who are brought up in dominator families, then instead of being able to express that frustration, that pain, that rage against the authority figure, which very often becomes over-idealized, you know, they deflect it, don't they? Against whom? Against the powerless groups. So you maintain your dominator model. So obviously, I'm going to have to explain to you a little bit about what I mean by a dominator and a partnership model of society. And I'm really always in a quandary on this because there are some of you here who have read The Chalice and the Blade, some of you who've read it 2 or 3 times, and of course there are also others here who are hearing about these ideas for the first time. So I am going to be dealing with some basics. And I'm going to be sharing a lot of information about my work with you and also about myself. Because I think that we are also beginning to recognize that what kind of work we choose to do and how we do it, that it really is very much connected, well, with the private, the personal. And as you heard, in my life, well, I was almost killed because of what happened, of the resurgence in Europe of a period, well, the rise of what, as you will see later, was a prototypical type of dominator society, the Nazi regime. So that certainly was an impetus in my life to be very, very concerned about the kinds of issues and the kinds of questions. And most important, the question that my work deals with, does it have to be this way? You know, I mean, do we have to have so much brutality? Do we have to hunt and persecute each other? Do we have to silence one another? Do we have to repress one another? Does there have to be war? Does there have to be this war of the sexes? And of course, my work actually indicates, you know, public-private, that the two are inextricably intertwined. So very early I had to ask myself these questions, and they were never for me academic questions, just as they are not for us, if we really think about it, really academic questions, because they affect everything about our lives. And then there was also my legal training, which was very, very helpful. Well, first of all, the first few books that I started to write, which were on law, one of them was on no-fault divorce, marriage, and the future of women. I was dealing with law already then, not as something isolated there, you know, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but in the social context. And I predicted in that book something that actually came to pass. It was published with McGraw-Hill in 1977. It was called Dissolution. And I predicted that no-fault divorce was going to have precisely the effect that it did have, what we today call the feminization of poverty, that a lot of middle-class women and children were going to be moving into poverty, not because it was an unjust law, very fair law, but because the social context was an unjust and imbalanced social context. And then I also wrote a book called The Equal Rights Handbook, which dealt with the Equal Rights Amendment. And again, I was very much interested in the whole picture in the social context. And I predicted in that book something that actually did come to pass. I said the history of American constitutional law has been one until now of continuing expansion of protection. If the expansion of the protection, of the constitutional protections to the majority, of the population is denied, what we are going to see, if we make this 180-degree turn back, we are going to see a period of great regression. And of course, that's exactly what we saw, didn't we? We began to see that the gains that we made in the 60s, in the early 70s, every one of them, every last one of them, we're fighting to preserve, we're fighting to protect, we're losing an inch here, we're gaining a half an inch there. So, but the legal training was also very, very important to me in the 15 years of multidisciplinary research from which the Chalice and the Blade, and a lot of the writings that I'm doing now, well, not only The Partnership Way, which, by the way, was a book that came out of the really enormous response to the Chalice and the Blade discussion groups, college adoptions, recovery groups, church groups, and people were saying, we want to have, some nitty-gritty, practical kind of tools, and that's what the Partnership Way is about, to actualize, to accelerate this shift from what I've called a dominator to a partnership society. And I wrote that book with my husband and partner, social psychologist David Lloyd, but also the body of writing that I am doing on human rights. That was very, very much aided by my legal training, because as I said to you, it was multidisciplinary work. I mean, drawing from disciplines ranging all the way from economics and political science and sociology to archaeology, and yes, chaos theory and nonlinear dynamics, if some of you are acquainted with the shift that science is beginning to take from just studying how systems maintain themselves, to all now beginning to study how there can be fundamental systems transformation. A very urgent subject if you consider, and this is of course the urgent issue for us in our time, that unless we have fundamental systems transformation globally, in my terms, because at a certain level of technological development, the dominator model literally destroys us, It's not technology, but it is that conquest-driven, domination-driven way of living that we've got to have a fundamental social transformation. So these are very urgent. But the legal training taught me something very, very important. It's pattern recognition. It's very interesting, because when somebody comes to a lawyer, they don't say, would you please apply section 1222 of the Civil Code? I mean, they come to you and they say, I've got this is a problem, and it's up to the attorney, isn't it, to look at the patterns to find out what the heck is going on here. So in this study, and I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the study from which all of this comes, I drew from a very, very large database. First of all, unlike many studies, that are concerned about human rights and about our survival and the ecology problems and, all of that, did not draw only from modern history, But I drew from a database that takes into account the whole of our history, and for reasons that I'll touch upon, and you'll see why, also our prehistory, because there is now an archaeological revolution revealing some very, very important information that we need to know about this adventure of ours here on Earth, our human adventure, our cultural evolution. And also, and I think perhaps even more important, it drew from a database that takes into account the whole of humanity, both its female and its male halves. And it's very funny, and I'm giving you a lot of introductory material because we're not used to thinking in these terms. But I think sometimes that if somebody were to come to a convention, say, of people who study animals, zoology, and say, I've just done a definitive study of, say, the grizzly bear. And you know what? I have focused almost exclusively on the male grizzly bear. Well, they would be laughed out of that scientific meeting. because of the inadequacy of their database, wouldn't they? But that's what we've been doing. So we have exactly been seeing the whole picture, have we? And what I'm proposing to you is that if you don't see the whole picture, you cannot see the connections, right? Because you're missing part of the picture. And what I began to see is what you'll see, that there are patterns, that there are certain things that go together. And I very, very quickly, because I really want to get back to the First Amendment, but I first want to lay, the conceptual framework for it for you. I want to give you some examples of what I mean by these patterns, because what I saw, these patterns came together into characteristic configurations that I began to identify, and I named them, one, the dominator model, the other one, the partnership model. And of course, models are abstractions, but as you'll see from the examples, if a society orients very, very closely to the dominator model, there are some very, very, very interesting consequences, including inherent in that model, an abridgment of precisely the rights that we're talking about. Now, let me give you some quick examples, and I'm going to take from cultures that are from really very, very different cultures. The Maasai of Africa, which is a tribal society, Nazi Germany, and Khomeini's Iran. And you're going to say to me, what could they have in common, right? They're such different societies. But what they have in common is a configuration. They are all highly warlike societies. The Maasai were the scourge of East Africa. Nazi Germany, we know, Khomeini's Iran, we know. But, and this is very important, it wasn't just the institutionalized violence of warfare. It's also, this is a model of society where violence and abuse are institutionalized at all levels of society. So they are characterized by wife beating, the Maasai. It's beginning to change, the wife beating, the genital mutilation. The women ask freedom of speech. We move more towards the partnership model. They're beginning to speak. They're beginning to say we will not do the genital mutilation to our daughters anymore, okay? But that was not possible as long as it was still in the rigid, dominator model. The violence in the Nazi family. How many of you know Alice Miller's work, by the way? Well, more of you should read it, because obviously she points out that that abusiveness and violence in the family of Germany of that time, and Hitler's family, which was not atypical, had a great deal to do with what happened, all right? So we have wife beating, we have child beating in those societies. The second part of the configuration goes with it. It is rigid male dominance, okay? The domination of one half of humanity over the other, backed up by force, of course. Just like any domination is backed up ultimately by force, be it rape, wife beating, what have you. And thirdly, a generally authoritarian and hierarchic social system, if you will, strongman rule both in the state and in the family. And what you see, of course, is something very obvious then. In this model of society, it is antithetical, it is inimical, right, to the protection of human rights, because it is precisely the violation of human rights that keeps the system together, all right? And, we have subcultures, and we have strong dominator traditions. Remember when we used to say, spare the rod and spoil the child? Today, as we're moving more towards a partnership model, we're saying, hey, that's child abuse, isn't it? We're beginning to talk about, well, let me stay with the dominator model first, and then, we'll get back to that. But you're such a nice audience. It's sort of like I'm talking with you, having a conversation with you. But I'm suggesting to you that if you look at fundamentalism, be it in Islamic fundamentalism or here, that it has far less to do with religion than it does with a dominator model of society, beginning with, of course, the repression of freedom of speech or freedom of worship. You worship my way because I have the only direct line to the deity, I talk on the phone and you don't. Okay? It's that kind of thing. And so you're going to do it my way, not your way. Get women back in their traditional place. Wonderful code word for subservient. We're beginning to learn. We got to reclaim these words, like family, tradition, okay? Got to re-own them here. All right, and also, of course, you see holy war. Holy war. I mean, let us have blood sacrifices to punitive deities, right? So you see, it's a dominator configuration. It's on the left too, Cuzescu's Romania. If those of you who know about it, Stalin's Russia. I mean, in other words, it's a configuration that really, and it is always the same configuration. It represses human rights, okay? And it's a whole integrated system. But the good news is that as you start moving more towards the other side of the spectrum, you begin to see a very different configuration. You see it, the configuration, well, you see it in tribal societies like the Mambuti of the African Congo. You see it in very technologically advanced societies like the Scandinavian nations, who are moving much closer to the partnership model. And of course you see it in trends here too. What am I talking about? I'm talking about a much more equal partnership between the two halves of humanity, between women and men. I mean, we're still talking about parental leave and about the right of people to have a family life, I mean, that whole model of the workplace, if you really think about it, the assembly line model was a dominator model. It wasn't the Industrial Revolution that made it so dehumanizing, okay? Or that made sweatshops where women got locked in and couldn't get out. Remember the Triangle Fire? Those of you who know about it, it was the dominator model. It wasn't the technology, all right? So what I'm saying is that what they are developing there is much more of a model where human rights can flourish, because there is also a more equitable distribution of wealth, but it didn't turn into the kind of socialism, all right, that happened in the Soviet Union, which of course was a dominator socialism. They had no foundations, all right, in their personal relations, in the changes, between the private and the public. Do you see what I'm talking about? For it to root in a different way. And of course the first peace academies, a tremendous number of publications on human rights and on freedom of speech, they all came out very much, and they're still leaders in the Scandinavian world. And we also see a lot of partnership trends in our time, but one of the most fascinating things, and I'm very, very quickly going to put this in our cultural evolution context, is the archaeological evidence now indicating that actually this partnership model, this model that, if you will, does not constantly distort and quench and repress our human potential, which is really what the Bill of Rights is about, isn't it? What the First Amendment is about, letting us develop and flourish, freely express ourselves. That actually the first civilizations that we read about, were already dominator model civilizations, but it turns out that there's a whole era of civilization because of new dating methods which have changed dating scales, like societies that were once dated at 600 before the Common Era, 600 BC we call it, were 6000 BC. We now know that there were far, far earlier Neolithic, and I always laugh when I say Neolithic because somebody said to me, Neolithic, is that an ointment? And no, it's not an ointment, it's the name archaeologists give to the first agricultural societies. And these societies, which gave us the foundations, okay, on which all later civilization was built, oriented more to the partnership model. And so also, as a matter of fact, did a civilization that was discovered at the turn of the century, the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. Very fascinating civilization, highly technologically developed, the first paved roads in Europe, the first plumbing, which always impresses Americans tremendously, But the point of it is, again, that these were societies that were more peaceful, where the kind of images that incite, let's really look at it. Images of heroic warfare, they're practically absent in the art of these societies, but so also are fortifications and signs of destruction of warfare, okay? Also images of men raping women. Don't see them. And it isn't just modern pornography now, that has all of this erotization of violence. It's so insidious, isn't it? Because once you eroticize violence, don't you? There was a quote in the newspaper about a young man who said, killing the men in the foxholes, that was even better than sex. Did you read that quote? And you think, how can that happen? Well, I'll tell you how that can happen. You eroticize violence. You eroticize domination and humiliation of another human being, and you end up with people who truly do enjoy torturing and killing. So, again, you don't see those kinds of images in the art of these societies. And the art of Minoan Crete was really incredible in the joyfulness, the freedom of its expression. Now, I've given you this total picture so that we can quickly go back to recorded history and to the present. Because what we see now about the First Amendment is that after the shift, and there was in our prehistory, and I cannot possibly take time here to tell you about it. I mean, it is in The Chalice and the Blade, it's in books by archaeologists like James Maillard, who excavated Çatalhöyük, which is the first really large, immense Neolithic site ever found. In Turkey, the work of UCLA archaeologist Maria Gimbutas, the work of Nicholas Platon, the former director of the Acropolis Museum, who excavated Minoan civilization for many years. And what really, and in The Chalice and the Blade, of course, there was a shift from a partnership to a dominator model of society, largely through warfare, through invasions from the periphery of dominator pastoral hordes. Now, what happened after that shift was the laying of precisely the kind of infrastructure that has made it impossible, unless we change that infrastructure for our basic human freedoms to become rooted. So if you look at recorded history, you see a very interesting thing. You see, for example, there have always been partnership resurgences. I mean, early Christianity, right? But then came the dominator regression. And of course, Jesus, I mean, he was basically killed for freedom of speech. You know, he was saying things that people did not like, right? Classical Greece, freedom of speech. I mean, remember Socrates? I mean, the guy said some stuff that they didn't like. Off with him to the hemlock, you know? So, look at the so-called good old days of the Age of Faith, right? The Middle Ages, where you had drawing and quarterings on every street corner because some heretic was saying something that the church didn't like, or because some, quote, witch, you know, the healers, really, and the people who still clung to some of the remnants of the old religion were a great mother deity and a bull god. You know, the bull god became the devil of Christian iconography, by the way, which is, I mean, I'm giving you so much information, but I'm really trying to sort of put this in some kind of context, because for me, one of the exciting things is when we begin to understand why something as simple, right, as the First Amendment, why should we have so much trouble with this darn thing? Well, we have so much trouble because we have been living for about 3,000 to 5,000 years with a lot of dominator ideology and a lot of dominator institutions. Now, the good news is that we are living in a time where the partnership thrust is stronger than it has been ever in recorded history. And I've already hinted at to you why. The reason is simply this, survival. The human thrust for survival. Because the dominator model is a model. We're beginning with the ranking of one half of humanity over the other. The primary principle of human organization is ranking, be it man over woman, be it man over man, be it race over race, or be it nation over nation. And it is a ranking that cannot be maintained without being backed up by force or the fear of force. So you're beginning to see why I'm talking about these two pillars. You know, on the one hand, the freedoms of expression, and on the other hand, the freedom from fear of institutionalized dominator violence. We'll always have some violence, hey? I mean, we're not talking about ideal societies. These earlier societies weren't ideal, and we're not going to build an ideal society. But the problem we have is that we are dealing with institutionalized abuse and violence. So how do you really expect with that as still so firmly embedded in so many of our myths, so much of our mass media, so much of the air we breathe practically, and so much of what we're told is really, you know, the kind of family we should have or the kind of way that we should live. How do you really expect, without taking a systems view now, that looks at these traditions and also looks at the relationship between all elements of the system, the public and the private. How can we lay the foundations? So I want to address myself to that, because I think that a lot of what's happening in our time, because it is so urgent, okay? Because this way of, quote, resolving conflict. See, there's conflict in the partnership model too, but hey, isn't this wonderful? We're finally seeing some partnership trends. Instead of war colleges, we're having peace colleges. We're having places where we're studying nonviolent conflict resolution. Do you see what I'm talking about? I mean, these are ways of laying foundations for respect for our basic human rights. Because freedom of speech is infringed of by fear or the threat of violence, basically. Isn't that what keeps us from talking? All right, so we are seeing a lot of partnership trends in our time because the situation is so urgent, because that model, including the domination of nature, the conquest of nature, right? Well, lots of luck, because nature herself is now beginning to say, you change your ways or I'll find me another species. So it's a very, very powerful partnership thrust in our time, but there's also enormous dominator resistance. So you see this dynamic. You see in the Soviet Union, you saw the movement towards partnership, you see the dominator resistance. In fact, I would submit to you that the stronger the partnership thrust, the stronger the dominator resistance until the shift, until you have enough mass to really make it over the line. So we were going to have the peace dividend, right? So we got the war in Iraq, or with Iraq. And of course, with war comes censorship, doesn't it? Always. You're beginning to see the system's relationship here. I mean, these things don't happen in a vacuum. With war also comes the re-idealization of masculine identity, that insanity, that to be a real man, you've got to be mean. I mean, that's not being a real man. There's a wonderful football player, Alec Harris, who wrote a thing about the wimp, this huge man, and he said the wimp is the macho man because it is being kind, that is being strong. So we're talking and there's some wonderful masculine characteristics, by the way, and I'm being non-linear here because whatever you take away, don't take away the idea that this is an issue of women against men or men against women. But we're talking about some so-called masculine characteristics, risk-taking, assertion, tremendous, but women are entitled to those too, just as men are also entitled to some of the so-called feminine. And I say so-called feminine because, and if we don't address those sexual stereotypes, we're back right with this problem of how the private, the intimate relations, we don't have the foundations for freedom of speech. So let me get to, so I can wind this up with you, to some of the really important partnership trends that are taking place that are going to help us expand the foundations. Because what we've been addressing is the tip. As miraculous as the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights was, it still only addressed the tip of the dominator pyramid. And now we need to address the foundations globally, not just in this country. And so one of the trends, for example, which I find fascinating, is everybody's suddenly waking up and they're saying we all come from dysfunctional families based on control. Well, I mean, right. This is the dominator family. It's perfectly appropriate to maintain a dominator model of society in which you do not have freedom of speech. Forget it. I mean, you either get physically or psychologically beaten, right? What do we want to move toward? We want to move towards a family based on trust. Well, it will never be complete trust, but I mean, at least we won't institutionalize abuse, okay? So this is a very, very important, partnership movement. So many of these things that are beginning to happen in our time, the international peace movement, the international women's movement, the human rights movement, conferences such as this one, which are saying, hey, let's probe deeper. Let us go beyond the issue of censorship and see what lies behind all of this. Let us see how we can build the foundations. And I would like to tell you about some thoughts that I have on building the foundations globally. I have written a paper when the war started. A lot of us sort of went into shock, I think. And one of the things that my response was, as long as there are nations that have this kind of, I mean, Iraq was really very much of a dominator model, okay? I mean, terror in the family. I don't know how many of you know there was an item in Le Monde, probably nobody, because things about women just don't make the press. In Le Monde at the beginning of last year, that Saddam Hussein's regime had introduced legislation that would again legally protect men from any fear of punishment for the so-called honor killing of women in their families. Now think about it. Terror in the family, terror in the state, international terror, repression of freedom of every kind in the family. But you're beginning to get the systems connections that I'm talking about. The tragedy is that people who want to take the freedoms away from us understand the connections much better than those of the majority of the people who want to maintain them. And for a moment then, before I really continue with what I think we need to do to strengthen, I want to get to this other side, because I said to you that I think we also need to re-examine this whole issue of speech that is designed to incite violence and hate. That kind of speech, not censorship, but accountability. There is a very, very important movement, and as a matter of fact, people right here are in the forefront of that movement of legislation and of court cases holding people accountable if their speech inciting violence and hate results in just that, in violence and hate. And there have been, the decisions, for example, the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, as you know, has worked on some of these cases. There has been the lawsuit in Alabama, that a mother of a young 19-year-old black man who was killed by 3 members of the Klan because they were incited to kill the first black that they found, And these people were held accountable. They were held liable. Now, this is what I'm really proposing. I am proposing that we give very, very serious thought to legislation, not what Catherine McKinnon proposed, which was too broad. Some of you are acquainted with her civil rights ordinance in Minnesota, which was the anti-pornography civil rights ordinance, which would have given civil actions against any form of representation of women in a degrading, humiliating, as well as violence, and abuse of women. I think that's too broad, but I am saying that speech, that writings, that actually are designed to incite hatred, contempt, and violence against traditionally powerless groups, not only women, but blacks, Jews, whatever they are in that community, that people who engage in that kind of speech be held accountable for the consequences. So, for example, when Hustler magazine a few years ago had this gang rape, in its publication, and a few months ago a young woman was gang raped, and the guy said, oh yeah, we saw it in Hustler magazine. Well, Hustler needed to be held accountable for the effect of that, and I guarantee you that kind of accountability will have an effect on that kind of speech. But that's not censorship. We don't want to censor it because and this is not an issue of obscenity, I mean, I really want to say to you that in the dominator model there is some implicit censorship that is really amazing when we think about it. We consider obscene and censor images of sexuality, of birth giving, of life giving. The old iconography is full of images of women giving birth. We think they're obscene and they are censored, be it officially or unofficially, and yet we do not consider obscene images of people dismembering other people, killing other people, torturing other people. In fact, the airwaves are flooded with those images. Now, if those images had no effect, I mean, look, campaigns inciting violence, modeling violence. In Germany, how do you think the Nazi thing happened against the Jews? It happened through campaigns inciting hate and violence. When there were lynchings in the South, how do you think it happened? It happened after campaigns inciting lynchings, violence. In other words, we have a lot of historical evidence showing, well, look, I mean, you know, in the media, they tell us, to tell people who purchase commercials, you know, what you see, what you're going to buy here is really going to affect behavior, right? People are going to buy your product. But then they turn around and they say, well, what we show here, you know, the constant barrage, equating violence with fun, eroticizing violence and hate and degradation, oh, that has no effect. It only affects one kind of behavior, purchasing behavior. Well, it's obviously, I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it? So what I'm suggesting is not censorship, and certainly not on the basis of obscenity. We need to completely redefine what we mean by obscenity, because the human body is not obscene. Sexuality and giving pleasure and taking pleasure and giving birth, that is not obscene. But what we do need to think about is how certain kinds of speech that people are not held accountable for maintain a dominator model of society, maintain the scapegoating, and thus undermine the very protections of the freedoms that we are trying to build the foundations for. So let me close with some proposals to you. Because after the Gulf War, it became very, very clear to me that that was just the tip of the iceberg, if you will. There are many other nations now who conform much more rigidly to the dominator model than we do. And goodness knows we've got our dominator elements right here. And they're very, very deeply entrenched. But, you know, and that so many of these societies are now acquiring weapons of total destruction, bacteriological warfare, nuclear warfare. So unless we begin to address the foundations, no right is going to be protected, because there won't be any of us left to exercise any rights. And that's when I really started to very seriously think of this right of freedom from fear of institutionalized dominator violence. And what would be some of, and that was the twin pole, if you will. You know, one, you have the freedom of speech and expression protections and the human rights protections, and the other one is the protection from that, and that the two are the two pillars that we need to build. And I thought one thing would be a global campaign against violence and abuse in the family. That is something that organizations can really network around. It will strengthen freedom of speech. Most parts of the world don't have freedom of speech, in case you haven't noticed. Because there's so much terror. I mean, is there freedom of speech in Guatemala? In El Salvador? I mean, in the Middle East? I mean, forget it. I mean, freedom of assembly. I mean, a woman can't even go drive a car. She can't go out of her house by herself. She can't go out of her house at all without sort of completely covering herself, you know, in some of these fundamentalist places. Talk about a denial of freedom of expression. You can't even express through your facial features, through your expressions. I mean, let's think about that. Why would we expect these countries not to be as they are, not to have those kinds of freedoms? Not that we're holier than they, okay? I mean, we've got our own problems, but the thing has to be global. So that's one thing. And the other thing, and I think this is really fundamental, and there are many other things than this, but I will close on this note, is really to unite in a campaign for partnership, education, and entertainment. Not by protesting against things like Two Live Crew. You protest and they sell 2 million copies because of the publicity, right? But by crowding those images out, by when you see programs, when you see materials that really model respect for human rights in our intimate relations, in all of our relations, okay? To say, hey, this was really a fun program. This was really a good program. Do more of it. And we're seeing trends in that direction. So what I've proposed to you is doable. It's not going to be easy. Laying the foundations for the First Amendment, obviously. We've had, quite a while of having the foundations for a very, very different kind of social order, and we're just breaking out of that. But we are breaking out of it. So what I'm suggesting to you is that it can be done, but it requires a unified view. It requires recognizing that how we structure the relations between the two halves of humanity, which is what women and men are, is a central, not a peripheral issue. It requires paying attention to how we structure the relations between parents and children, how we structure relations in the workplace. The good news, of course, is that in many of the major corporations, they're finally discovering, that if people's rights are infringed upon, if their freedom of speech is infringed upon, if they're scared, they're not as creative and productive. Isn't that amazing? So, they are beginning to move more towards laying the foundations, if you will. You see what I'm talking about here? For a world where in all areas, not just in the political, but also where we live, in our everyday lives. Human rights, beginning with this fundamental human right of freedom of speech, of expression, of spiritual expression too, which is of course what freedom of worship is, and separation of church and state is all about, to this new but very, very ancient right that we need to start thinking about, freedom of fear from institutionalized dominator violence, that we can begin to build the foundations on which these rights can rest, so that we can stop fighting all these darn defensive battles and get on with the human adventure, with our evolution personally and culturally here on Earth. I thank you. Or do something in a little while, but I really would like to talk with you a little bit if you'd like.
We have a microphone here in the center aisle if any of you would like to ask questions, and we probably will limit the questioning and see where we go.
I've left you speechless. No, there's somebody who's going to talk.
I'd like to ask you a question on the First Amendment. If I have my opinion, you have your opinion, and therefore we're talking about another country, and I want to express my views on the First Amendment and their culture, and they have a different belief, aren't I then suppressing their right of First Amendment of their culture?
That's such an important question, because what you're reaching is the issue of ethnic and cultural tradition. Now, I'm not saying that you and I should go into Saudi Arabia and say, look, folks, you're really very feudal here. And in Kuwait, for example, where about 15 years, the good news that they were no longer chopping off hands in punishment for theft with an axe, but they were doing it in a hospital, that, with anesthetic, that this is really very barbaric, even if it may be an ethnic tradition. It's not for you and me to do that, but it is for you and me to pressure our government and our organizations to link aid to these nations, to strengthen the human aspirations of the many people in those cultures. Women are organizing, but with such horrendous difficulties. There's a group called Muslim Women Living in Exile, for example, in Montpellier, in France. Their funding is zip, and they put out these urgent bulletins every week. This is being done to women. Fundamentalists are restricting, again, the right of women to even go to college, to even go outside of their dormitories. Let us not go in there and say, you will do it our way. This is the partnership we are in. You will enjoy it. That's pretty dumb, right? But let us strengthen the human aspirations of these people. And let us also remember this. All cultural traditions were once hallowed ethnic traditions, including cannibalism, And I think that we really sort of need to begin in terms of our traditions too. Like I say to people, I'm a very traditional person, but I happen to orient to much more ancient traditions. Traditions that we're now finding out about. Where in terms of the title of my book, the chalice, rather than the blade, was the symbol of the highest power.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. I have a myriad of questions, but I'll just limit it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the introduction of your book, you speak of, and let me quote, socialists and communists asserting that the root of the problems is capitalism, and capitalists and socialists and communism is leading us to ruin. My question is, who or what do you feel is the root of the problems? And I know you're going to say the dominator, but I'm wondering who the dominator is.
I'm so glad you asked that. The issue is not who the dominator is. The issue is what tapestry, and I'm going to use a feminine image now, the image of weaving, of tapestry. What tapestry of belief and of infrastructure we have created and can create. And I would suggest to you that the failure, quote, of communism in the Soviet Union was really predictable. It is a direct continuum from the Tsarist dominator regime. I mean, why would we expect? You know, Trotsky, in exile, he said you can't just abolish the family, because that's what they tried to do in the early days of the revolution before they decided to go back to the patriarchal family again. You've got to change the family. I would like to suggest that it didn't root none of this equity. I mean, I went to the Soviet Union as a guest of the government. I lived better there than I do here. I mean, because at that time, the elites, you know, before the sabotage by the apparatniks, you know, because, you know, they're holding back all of the supplies so that perestroika will fail and glasnost will fail. I mean, we know that that's one of the major problems. But what I'm suggesting to you is it is not a who. It is a system that we have all internalized. You and I carry a lot of dominator junk in me. My husband and I are constantly trying to work out, you know, that whole issue of how do we really take turns being leaders, because the partnership model is not leaderless. This is not the 60s where we're going to do some kind of strange, you know, tribal dance. I mean, no, I mean, the 60s were valuable, but we were very naive. So what I'm suggesting is that it is the system that we need to change, but that the system lives in us every time that you and your wife or your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whatever, you know, your relationship, your most intimate relationship is. When you re-examine how you relate to each other in terms of both your needs and both your aspirations, you are helping to change the system. But then you also need to lobby so that in 1994, when we have the Year of the Family of the United Nations, these dominator people who really believe that that's the only model, see, come in and they say, like Laxalt. Do you remember Laxalt's family protection bill? He was going to do away with shelters for battered women. That's the kind of family he was going to protect. So I'm suggesting that you work personally, but that you also work economically and politically, and that it isn't a who. And men are not the enemy any more than women are the enemy.
One more quick one.
May I ask you to save it, because there is somebody after you. Thank you.
I wonder if you would comment on the actions of the American Civil Liberties Unions. Sometimes I feel very ambivalent and uncomfortable.
Well, as a former vice president of a local chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union, I have to say that it is an enormously important organization. And I also have to say that I have been fighting them on this for 10 years. I mean, I've been basically saying to them what I said to you today. I've said, what are you doing? Yes, fight against censorship. Fight against government interference, because that we don't want. But at least support civil actions. Don't, you know, they're very much in denial, is what they really are in. But they're not alone. We're all in denial. I mean, on this pornography thing, for example, we are in denial. We deny the obvious, that if you eroticize cruelty and domination, people are going to really become addicted to it, aren't they? If you keep showing it as entertainment and fun. We're in a dominator model, we're all addicted to violence in one way or another. And women, of course, who are not supposed to be violent, are addicted to suffering. So It's really, I mean, talk about an addictive society here. And we're all addicted to trying to escape from it in one way or another because it's so tense. So that's my opinion of the ACLU. More power to them, and would they please come to their senses?
Back just a moment to the issue of impressing these ideas on other countries. I think it's rather ethnocentric of our country to believe that we need to take our ideas elsewhere and fund a particular group of people. We don't even have them to the right proportions yet here. And as an American taxpayer, I believe our money should be spent in our country first, and once we get the whole thing straight, then maybe we should step out to other countries and let them know what we've found. But to start funding groups in Saudi Arabia is ethnocentric of our society, to believe that we're right.
Well, you know, I'm going to take, I hear what you're saying, but I'm going to take a very different approach. I'm going to say to you that if we do not support the destabilization of dominator regimes globally, all right? And the only way to do that is to support the human rights aspirations of the people in those societies. We are going to end up with a war where bacteriological warfare and nuclear warfare is used. Because in a rigid dominator society, I mean, the reason that Saddam Hussein, one of the most interesting things, I have to digress for a moment, was a newsreel from Kuwait, where they were showing what they think of Saddam Hussein by putting lipstick and rouge on him. It was contempt for him because he lost. I mean, hear me. In a rigid dominator model of society, cruelty and oppression is admired. All right? If you win, that's fine. If you use terror, that's fine. I don't think this is a question of being ethnocentric. When I went to Nairobi in 1985, and I met with women from almost every nation of this world, from Africa, from Asia. When I met with African women who said, not so jokingly, she said, you know, these African men in their shiny black shoes and their Western suits, they tell us that they want to keep traditions. But what they really mean is that they want modernization for themselves, but they want to maintain our oppression, our illiteracy. This is not being ethnocentric. This is listening to voices that have been silenced. And this is what we're really talking about, to permit more freedom and to facilitate more freedom of expression by traditionally powerless groups all over the world. So I will have to really say to you that I no longer think in terms of ethno-anything. I think that we are all children of this planet and that we are a global family. And as in Nairobi, when women from Maasai tribes walked miles barefoot with children on their back, some of them crippled, because somehow they had heard that finally there was going to be a meeting addressing some of their needs, some of their problems, some of their aspirations. I want to support that. And I do not consider supporting a woman or a man who wants human dignity, who wants freedom from violence, who wants freedom of expression. I believe that these, as the Declaration of Independence, unfortunately using only the word man, broadening it, as did in 1948 Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to women and men, that all humans, women and men, have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that is what I believe.
I'd just like to get your comment on a thought that struck me. You used the Maasais of East Africa and the Nazis of Germany and Khomeini as models of dominator society and gave some characteristics, rigid male dominance, generally authoritarian, hierarchical, and societal structure, basically. Now, I have heard many times and feel myself that nowhere in the history of the world, at least the modern world as we know it, have men, women, children, minorities and the general lifestyle reached such a high level and so quickly as in the United States of America. And people who have traveled abroad still like to get back. My question is that I noticed that all three of these also have another characteristic, and that is the suppression and rooting out of Christianity from the public forum. And I've noticed that the regressive period to which you refer in our own nation precisely parallels the repression of Christianity from the public forum in our own nation. And and I would like to have your comment on that. That's how I feel. And so I would like to ask you, this to me has appeared to be behind it all. There comes to be a undertoning of a repression of Christianity, and that to me is extremely seductive and very dangerous.
Well, you have asked a very, very interesting question, and there is a chapter in The Chalice and the Blade in which I deal with so-called primitive or original Christianity. Now, if what you're talking about is what it seems Jesus preached, which is caring, nonviolence, compassion, the, quote, feminine values, right? And if by Christianity you mean truly an honoring of women, as Jesus did. He spoke freely to women in a society that was as rigidly sexually segregated as fundamentalist Iran. If by Christianity you mean early Christian communities where women and men both baptized and took leadership, and where the deity was seen as both Divine Mother and Divine Father, like some of the persecuted Gnostic sects, yes, I could say to you that Christianity and the suppression of that has a lot to do with it, but I would have to categorically contradict a lot of the implications of what you're saying, because historically, and this is very tragic, but unfortunately Christianity, from the day of the alliance with Constantine, and even before that, dear Constantine, who boiled his wife alive and killed his son, but had a vision of Christianity as the official religion of the state, of the inquisitors who burned and tortured people for their own good, of the crusaders, of the enormous harm that has been done and continues to be done in the name, using the name of Christianity in vain, okay? Then I would have to say to you that to the extent that Christianity or Hinduism or Buddhism or Mohammedanism or Judaism or any of our world religions have an overlay of dominator elements, to that extent they are in the service of the dominator model. If we could only reclaim those teachings, but that is not what a lot of the battle of the separation of state and church is about today. Unfortunately, to a very large extent, it is quite the contrary. So in your heart and my heart, we are agreed on the basic principles, but unfortunately, or fortunately perhaps, because I have so thoroughly looked at history, I cannot agree. I mean, Gandhi, who was not a Christian, was such a noble human being. My friend Abida Khanum, who is a Muslim, who had to escape from fundamentalist Pakistan after being arrested and tortured for the crime of trying to help women in the sense of Christianity as kindness and lovingness and the chalice values. They all have those. Christianity does not, even in its pure form, and certainly we haven't seen its pure form through most of recorded history, does not have a monopoly on it. Thank you.
In the dominant system in which we culturally currently live, we seem to have been able to keep minorities effectively suppressed. And how do we get out of all, as minorities, always how to get away from just being defensive because our rights are taken. And the greater frustration too for me is that because we're fractured and we have little power, we're always fighting with each other rather than fighting against the dominator.
That's the way the dominator model maintains itself, doesn't it? Instead of, during the Iraq War, instead of trying to think of long-range strategies to lay the foundations for a world of peace, we were seeing people fighting each other. You should demonstrate, you shouldn't demonstrate, you should this, you should that. Hey, that's how the system keeps itself. It's, and a lot of the New Age movement too, it's a lot of the sandbox syndrome. Let the children play in the sandbox, with the Aquarian ages coming. So what I'm suggesting to you is that it's hard, as you know, but I'm also suggesting to you that it can be done. That once people begin to see the connections, all right, that these things all are sort of intermeshed, it becomes much easier to work together. And I want to close really by using your question as a springboard for something that we obviously have to address, which is economics. Because if we are not to change our economic systems beyond capitalism and communism, to give the highest value, rather than saying it has no value, to the caring work and to the cleaning work that has been traditionally in the dominator model relegated to women for no pay or very little pay, we're not going to change the system. If we're not going to pay attention to intra-family economic distribution. Look at India. The latest UNESCO statistics is that 25% of Indian girls do not live to the age of 15 because of systematic patterns of violence and economic discrimination through selective malnutrition. Indian girls are 4 or 5 times more likely to have malnutrition than boys, and yet boys are 50 times more likely to be sent for medical help for malnutrition. If that is our model of economic justice in our families, where there are people who, according to United Nations statistics, women do 2/3 of the world's work, and in reward for that, earn 1/10 of the world's earnings and own 1/100th of the world's property. Do you know how many societies there are where women by custom or law can't own property or can't manage property? If that is our model, why would you not see male elites in the developing and developed world ally themselves to exploit masses of people who are doing the hard work, when this is the model right there in our families, in our everyday work, in our everyday lives? And finally, I'm going to close with something that's sort of funny, but it isn't. I say it half joking. I sometimes say, women would never have created nuclear waste with no idea of what to do with it. This notion that you create something and have no idea of where to put it can only come out of a culture where the cleaning work, right? You got me? So, because men are brought up and women are brought, listen, this is not women against men. It's the mothers who tell Jane, will you help me with the dishes? And John, you go, do whatever, play Nintendo games or whatever you're going to be doing, right? It is not men against women. It's this whole lunacy. So men are brought up to think there's always going to be somebody there to clean up after them, right? A woman. So I'm suggesting that these personal issues, they're very, very political, aren't they? I thank you.
I want to invite you to participate.